Okay, let's dive into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating paper by Ryan McLean called The Grammar You Cannot Refuse. We're going to explore a pretty profound idea here, which is that absolutely everyone, no matter their worldview, operates on a shared foundational grammar of belief, right? So whether you're deeply religious, a committed atheist, a scientist, or a philosopher, you are already using certain intellectual tools before you even open your mouth to make an argument.
But, before we get into all the heavy philosophy, I actually want to ground us with some unexpected wisdom from the legendary Betty White. She once said, just open your mind, stay interested in stuff. I'm still curious about them. I just love starting with this because, frankly, we're about to tackle some massive concepts today. Stuff like truth, reason, existence itself. And bringing Betty's sense of curiosity and open-mindedness, that's just the absolute best way to approach this material. It keeps us grounded, it keeps us humble, and ready to learn.
So, here's how we're going to break this all down step by step. First, we'll look at the myth of unbelief. Second, the grammar of thought. Third, science and atheism. Fourth, the borrowing problem. And finally, we'll wrap up with the Catholic claim.
All right, let's start with part one, the myth of unbelief. So the author kicks things off by systematically tearing down this cultural myth of the totally neutral non-believer by strictly defining what belief actually is. It's not just some religious activity. Belief, as defined here, is simply the act of accepting, considering, or treating a proposition as true. I mean, think about it. When you sit in a chair, you believe it's not going to collapse under you, right? When you study for a test, you believe that studying actually works. Belief is just a basic, totally unavoidable operation of human thought. Because of that definition, just saying I don't believe is actually grammatically incomplete. It's missing an object. The author points out that refusing one belief is usually just asserting another one. So if someone says they don't believe in God, operationally speaking, they are treating a different proposition as true, like perhaps the proposition that God does not exist, or maybe that natural explanations are entirely sufficient on their own.
And this brilliantly illustrates the author's taco analogy. Imagine someone loudly declaring, "I don't eat food," all while dramatically chewing on a taco. You don't need a theology degree to spot the contradiction there. Like, okay, they might not eat broccoli, they might refuse mushrooms, but they're still eating something. The point is, nobody gets to float above belief like a smug balloon. If you argue, if you test, doubt, or explain anything, you are already holding some taco of truth in your hand.
Which brings us to section 2, the grammar of thought. What we're looking at here maps out the author's argument that everyone, atheist, Catholic, scientist, skeptic, whoever, is playing on the exact same board before they even start arguing about which team they belong to. You don't just pick a worldview and then decide to use logic. You actually have to use logic to pick the worldview in the very first place. The paper outlines these as unavoidable constraints. Words constrain meaning. You can't just make a word mean anything you want, or communication completely collapses. Reason constrains inference. Once you understand a concept, certain conclusions just naturally follow. Reality constrains truth. You can say fire is cold all you want, but that doesn't make it true. Reality gets the final vote. And evidence constrains belief. Clues actually point to real things that happened. Now, these constraints aren't the enemies of thought. They're actually the exact conditions that make discovering the truth possible in the first place. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it highlights the sheer absurdity of trying to deny these rules while you're actively using them. If someone argues reason doesn't work, well, they're using a reasoned argument to try and prove it. It's literally like trying to play Uno by throwing down a sandwich on the table and yelling checkmate. You can't use the rules of meaning to announce that there are no rules of meaning and expect everyone to just clap for you. It simply doesn't work.
All right, moving right along into section 3, science and atheism.
Here, the paper explains how secular frameworks also operate entirely within this grammar. It points out that science isn't the absence of belief. Rather, it's a highly disciplined practice built heavily on philosophical assumptions that it cannot actually prove in a lab. Think about it. Before a scientist conducts a single experiment, they already believe that nature is intelligible, that math reliably maps onto the physical world, that experiments genuinely reveal reality, and that rational inquiry is actually worth pursuing. These aren't anti-scientific notions at all. They are the very beliefs that make science fundamentally possible. The author relates this to baking, which I love. When you bake cookies, you assume your measuring cup is going to stay a measuring cup and not, spontaneously turn into a hamster. Science requires that exact same foundational belief in a stable, understandable world. You absolutely have to trust that the universe behaves predictably before you can even begin to study how it behaves. which naturally leads us to a massive question. If every single worldview out there, whether secular or religious, relies on this grammar of meaning, reason, truth, and evidence, where exactly does this grammar come from? Why is the universe understandable at all?
And that brings us to Section 4, the borrowing problem.
The text introduces this concept that a worldview might operate perfectly fine day to day while completely deferring its own explanation. Drawing on Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason, the author notes that an explanation simply cannot borrow forever. Eventually, the bill comes due. Secular worldviews often rely heavily on objective truth, logic, and evidence. But if the universe is ultimately just a random, indifferent accident, it's pretty difficult to ground why these concepts should be so incredibly reliable. They're using the tools, sure, but deferring the explanation of where those tools actually came from.
To anchor this incredibly dense philosophical problem, the author uses a great analogy about a pencil. Imagine borrowing your friend's pencil every single day. For a while, it works totally fine, but eventually, your friend is going to ask if you actually own a pencil yourself. Worldviews that use truth and reason without grounding them are essentially doing exactly this. They're passing around a borrowed pencil. But eventually, somebody has to actually own the foundation of reason.
Let's move to and see how this builds back into our main framework. You can see the borrowing problem mapped out right there. It visually links that foundational grammar we discussed earlier directly to this dilemma. Every worldview needs words, logic, and truth. But to use them without grounding them is basically to borrow what cannot be explained by that worldview's own rules. Which takes us to our fifth and final section, the Catholic claim.
Here, the text presents the Catholic framework. Drawing on philosopher Bernard Lonergan's progression of human knowing, we see 4 steps. We experience, we seek understanding, we make judgments, and we arrive at a decision. The claim being made here is that human reason naturally climbs upward. It looks at the order and intelligibility of the universe and naturally seeks an ultimate grounding, an unborrowed source that actually owns the pencil, so to speak.
So the crucial point is that the text outlines that the Catholic claim that the eternal word, the Logos, is the ultimate author of this shared grammar. It argues that reason can look at creation and deduce a creator. And in this view, faith isn't the opposite of reason. It's actually the fulfillment of it. Reason reaches God's existence, but revelation through Christ reveals who God actually is. The author uses this beautiful analogy of finding a letter on the sidewalk. Reason is a lot like finding that letter. You can study the handwriting, you can analyze the grammar, and you can learn a lot about the author just by using basic logic and evidence. It gets you incredibly far. But reason alone can't make the author walk around the corner and introduce themselves, right? Revelation, Jesus introducing the Father, is claimed as that personal introduction. It doesn't break the rules of reading the letter, it completes the entire experience.
This explainer wraps up with such a powerful takeaway. The universe is not just homework with stars glued on. It is a story with an author. And it really forces us to ask ourselves, are the tools we use every single day to think, to argue, and to live just random cosmic accidents? Or do they point to a deeper, grounded reality? It's just a fascinating lens through which to view how we all communicate and find meaning. Thank you so much for walking through this structured argument with me today. Keep asking those big questions, and as Betty said, stay curious.